Hey, I'm getting head nods, so we're good to go. Jill is going to monitor the chat box as we go along. So if you have questions, just type them in the chat box. You should be able to find that down at the bottom of your screen. Most of you are probably familiar with Zoom at this point. So, please ask your questions at the end. We'll answer the questions that would go along if we can. If not, we'll get them towards the end of the program, and we'll also open it up if you have any other questions, dealing with gardening. Might even take a chance and answer some of those for you today. So, but with early season gardening, if I can, one of the big things is, it's the time of year that we all get anxious, especially this year. We've been cooped up quite a bit and we all want to get out there and do some things. But we don't want to jump the gun too early. That you'll have more problems if you get things out too early, and have weather damage, frost damage, cold feet, things of that nature. Those are the things that we have to deal with. So, some of the things that you can be getting done this time of year is just a soil test. If you haven't done one, we recommend that every 3 to 4 years, just get a sample. Purdue Extension does not do those tests, but we have several companies, independent labs around the area that will do those. A&L Great Lakes Lab is one that I recommend here at the office. I've just had good results with them over the years. I like the reports that they send back, but you send in your sample and they will send you a detailed result based on what crops you are saying, whether it's going to be garden, vegetable, flowers, lawn, grass, trees, whatever it might be. But this soil test gives you a baseline and it tells you where your soil is. One of the most important things is pH level. We want that around the neutral pH. Neutral pH is 6.5 to 7 range. Most of our garden plants or vegetables like that pH in that neutral zone. pH can affect a lot of things in that soil. The main thing is it affects the availability of the nutrients, the macro and micronutrients in that soil. You see on the list here, some of the things they test for, but that pH can also affect, you might have an adequate level of a nutrient, but it's not available because your pH is too low or too high. I never recommend adding lime or adding sulfur to soil without a pH test, because you can actually do more harm to your soil by adding lime to it when you don't need it. So always recommend getting that soil test and seeing where you actually are. That soil test will also give you recommendations for fertilizer applications, to whether it's a basic application. Basic fertility application is what you need to bring those existing levels up to a normal level. And then we also have an annual maintenance application. This is what we figure those vegetables, those crops take out of that soil on a yearly basis. So, on the screen there, just a general guideline, and these are rough ballparks that just give you some idea. If you're using a 12-12-12 fertilizer, 6 pounds per 1,000 square feet is just a general ballpark of what we like to, to shoot for. But again, the basic application of fertilizer is what the soil test will say you need. And then that annual maintenance is what that plant takes out of that soil on a yearly basis. So it's just something to think about. Be thinking about what type of fertilizer you're going to use. Go get it, have it on hands ready. These can also be put on before. Actually, it's probably best if you put them on soil before you plant your garden. Get it tilled in, get it worked in, so that can be dissolving into that soil solution so it's ready for the plants to take up when you're ready to get the plants in the ground. Another thing that I always recommend to homeowners for gardens is organic matter. Adding organic matter is probably the #1 thing you can do to improve your garden soil, whether it's compost, leaves, grass clippings, whatever it might be, getting that organic matter into that soil. Couple things you need to think about as you're doing this. If it is composted material, if it's completely composted, you're getting it out of your compost pile in the back of the yard, or you're getting it at the local, supplier, you can typically add about 3 to 4 inches at a time if it's completely composted, and then get that tilled in, worked into the top 7 or 8 inches of soil. If it is fresh, grass clippings, if it is uncomposted dried leaves, things of that nature, I only recommend about 1 inch or 2 at most. Why? One, it's just harder to get tilled in to make it uniform in that soil profile. Other thing is, as that uncomposted organic matter, those leaves, those grass clippings start to break down in that soil profile, they can actually tie up that nitrogen. They can hold that nitrogen, take it away from that newly planted tomato plant that you put in the garden. So you can actually get nitrogen deficiency symptoms on your plants. There's plenty of nitrogen there. It is just being tied up in that natural breakdown process of that organic matter that you just put on the soil. So if it's fresh, just be a little light-handed, 1 to 2 inches. If it's completely composted, you can go to 3 or 4 inches as you till that in. Why do we add organic matter? Organic matter is we refer to it as the black gold that you can put into your garden soil. If you have poorly drained soil, a heavy clay soil, it will lighten that soil up. If you have a sandy soil that dries out a lot adversely during the summer, that organic matter will hold moisture around those plant roots. So it helps on poorly drained and well-drained soils. The other thing is it actually helps hold some of the nutrients in the soil profile. Those nutrients are then available for those plant roots to take up as they start growing. So again, anything you can do to get organic matter in there. One thing, not this time of year, but something to think about is planting a cover crop in the fall and tilling that all in early spring. Great way to get organic matter in that soil. So again, adding organic matter to that soil is a great thing to do this time of year before you can get the plants out there planted in the soil. Again, I'd like to remind everybody, if you have some questions, put them in the chat box and we'll be glad to answer those as we go along. Next thing is tillage. We get impatient. Again, we've been cooped up for a long winter. We want to get out there and get our hands dirty in that soil, but we want to be real careful that we're not working that soil wet. If you go out there like the bottom picture there and you grab a handful and squeeze it and it just stays that big mud ball in your fist, it is too wet. If you work that soil wet, you break down that soil structure, the way those soil particles are holding onto each other. If you break down that soil structure, you just get a gooey mess, and as it dries, you have brick beds out there. You have concrete, and you'll be beating those clods all summer long, because about the only thing that breaks down those clods once you make them is that freeze-thaw process in the winter. So again, if soil is wet, just go back out in the house, go somewhere else in the yard, do something else. Don't work that soil wet. You will regret it the rest of the growing season as we go along. So, the top handful of soil tells you what you need. If nice crumbly, you have to squeeze it, it just breaks apart. Good moisture to get out there and work that soil. Typically in a garden situation, we want 6, 7, 8 inches of soil tilled to provide root zone areas for those vegetables we're going to put in the garden. Another important thing that you can work on this time of year is really figure out what you're going to grow. What are you going to grow in the garden? Where are you going to grow it? How are you going to place it in the garden? Doing a little inventory with your family, figuring out exactly what vegetables do they like. What do if no one grows okra, if no one likes okra, why are you growing okra? Yes, it is a beautiful plant, has beautiful flowers on it. It looks nice in the garden, but if no one's going to eat it, why are you growing it? So think about what your family wants and needs are. How are you going to use the vegetables? Are you only growing for fresh on the table consumption, or do you want to process, freeze, can, dry some of those vegetables for use later on? So think about where you're putting things. Also think outside the box of outside of the normal garden plot that you're tilling up, that the 10 by 10 or the 20 by 20 plot that you have in the backyard. Think about other places where you can put vegetables in the landscape. Putting pots of herbs up on the deck by the back door is a good place to put them because you're more prone to use them in the kitchen if they are close to the kitchen. If you have to walk through the yard to go back and get the parsley or the cilantro to use for the dinner dish, sometimes you're not going to do that. But if they're real close to the back door, you can go out and clip a few, use it fresh on the dish. So think about where you can add in things. Herbs make actually nice landscape plants looking in the flower beds in the landscape. Think about where you can put those crops where you might be more easy to use them, or something that might add interest to a landscape. The other thing is we always recommend rotating your crops. We really don't like putting tomatoes after tomatoes year after year after year in the same spot. There just ends up problems with, you have more of a chance of having a disease or insect issue, if you are planting the same crop or the same family members of crops in that same spot. So if you can rotate them get a 3-year rotation, that will help break that disease cycle. With that said, if you have a garden spot like I do in the backyard, that's just basically an 8-foot by 8-foot square, it's real difficult to move those tomatoes enough in that area, to get that break in that disease cycle. So if you can rotate them, excellent. If not, we understand you just need to be more alert and seeing what you can do to prevent that diseases from getting a foothold. But have a plan, know what you're planting, know how many plants or seeds of each species you need, before you start going out and buying plants, buying seeds. Have a plan, know where you're going to put them, how you're going to lay it out before you start that garden plot. Jill, do we have any questions at this moment as we go along?
I was just getting ready to interrupt you. Yes, we do have one in the chat.
Okay.
And the question is, if you use hardwood mulch and you till it in the next year, will it be beneficial? Also, will this change the pH of the soil bed?
Okay, excellent question. Yes, using hardwood mulch and tilling it in is an excellent way to get organic matter into that soil. There are certain ones, some of the hardwoods, which will change the pH over time. I don't get real worried about it on a 1-year basis, but if you're doing it constantly, I would recommend maybe instead of doing that soil test on a 3-year basis, do it every other year, just so you can keep track of how that pH is being affected by that hardwood mulch. But hardwood mulch is an excellent thing to use in the garden to keep the weeds down, to help even out moisture throughout the growing season. And it can be tilled in and is very beneficial. But again, you might need to be checking on that even just not hardwood, but if you're using like pine bark or something like that, pine needles, again, keep a handle on that soil pH because it can affect it. Okay. Any other questions, Jill?
Nope, that's the only one in there so far.
Okay, excellent. The next thing to think about is, this time of year, we like to start our seeds indoors to get a jump on the season. How are we doing? We don't want to go out and buy those expensive plants because, they cost money and we can buy the pack of seeds for a lot less. So let's just start our seeds inside, and we can do that. And it's not a problem. A couple of things to think about is the timing of starting those seeds. It doesn't take long for like a zucchini plant to go from seed to a transplant size plant. You're talking, 3 to 4 weeks maybe, and you'll have a full size plant that can be transplanted. Something like a cabbage or broccoli might take, 7 to 10 weeks to get up to that size of transplant. So you need to get the calendar out and think about, when am I going to plant these? When to back up the number of weeks that it takes to get the transplant up to the size. And that's when you need to be starting those plants. We have a Purdue publication, I can think here, called Starting Seeds Indoors. I've got the link. I can place that in the chat box, or Jill can throw it in there if she can. HO14, Starting Seeds Indoors. One of us will drop that link into the chat box. It gives some good guidelines on timing, especially. How long before I want to plant the cabbage out do I need to start those seeds? A lot of this information is also on the back of seed packets. There's a couple seed packets, the back page panel of the seed packets, squash and kale on the screen there, but it gives you times how long it takes to germinate, which needs to be figured in this timeline too, because some seeds come up in a day or two, other seeds take a couple weeks before they germinate. So again, keeping that and figuring out that timeline is vitally important. Thinking about when we put those crops out into the ground. We can have some warm sunny days like we're having now and we get excited, but that ground hasn't warmed up yet either. Take your hand, actually feel how cool that soil still is. Generally, we break our vegetables down into 2 groups, cool season and warm season crops. Cool seasons, we're in the time that we can be putting out some of that cool season. We think, end of March, 1st of April, we can get some of those lettuces, some of the cool season cabbages, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli type of things. We're getting into the season where we can actually get those out and they'll do quite well. They can handle a little bit of frost, maybe not a hard freeze, but we're getting to that time frame that a lot of those can be placed out. Our warm seasons, our beans, our tomatoes, our sweet corn, they don't like to have cold feet. They don't like cold weather at all. So my general rule is always think about Mother's Day to put those warm season crops out. That first part of May, depending on where you are located, I'm basing this on Jackson County, Seymour, kind of south central Indiana, but that Mother's Day tends to be a good time to put those out. But the main thing here is, we don't want to start those seeds too early and then try to keep them inside longer. We want a nice, stocky, healthy, dark green transplant. We don't want one that's been kept for a while and it's all leggy and stretched out. It's not going to produce what you want. Speaking of that, the next thing on the list there is light. If you're starting seeds indoors, you almost have to give them some artificial light. Even though you put them next to a sunny window, it's going to take some artificial light. And the important thing with that is whatever you're using, whether you're using fluorescent fixtures, incandescents, halogens, LEDs, you want something that's giving a broad spectrum light that covers all the colors of the rainbow in that light wavelength. And you want to get those light fixtures, those light sources down as close to the plants as possible. I'm talking 1 to 2 inches off the top of the plants as they grow. So you need to have some type of adjustment that you can raise and lower those light fixtures as the plant grows. But giving artificial light is vitally important unless you have a greenhouse, that is in full sun. The next thing on the list there is containers. You can start seeds in just about any containers as long as they hold soil and they provide drainage. There's some on the screen, there's some plastic containers. There's some peat pots that are compressed peat moss that, you can use and start seeds in or grow plants in. Then you can buy all types of what's called jiffy pellets or compressed pellets. You put water on them and they expand. You can get snazzy little things that have covers to keep humidity up. But, anything again that holds potting soil and holds, allows for that water to drain out. Excess moisture is probably the death of more seedlings than anything else. My advice is always go a little on the dry side instead of overly wet. So, okay.
We have another question in the chat. How warm should the soil be when we plant onion sets?
Onion sets can tolerate a little bit of cool, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head, temperature wise. I'm coming up with 65, but don't quote me on that one exactly. But they can tolerate some coolness. I know I have a neighbor who has his onion sets out now and doing quite well. So but I'm thinking in the 65 range is what they need to be, but I could be off on that because I'm doing off the top of my head on that one. So, any other questions there, Jill?
Not at this time.
Okay, excellent. There are things that you can do to extend that growing season. We talk about starting seeds indoors, but there's other structures you can use outside. You can use a cold frame. Cold frame is basically a structure with a glass window pane on top of it. It protects them during the night, but it allows them to get the sunshine during the day. With cold frames, you just need to watch on sunny days that they can really heat up in there, and you can actually get some heat damage on those crops by, you have to have some way to prop the window open. There's fancy automatic openers if you want to get real technology savvy, but a stick propping the window up does quite well on a sunny day. Row covers on the right there, will give some light frost protection. It's just a remade polyester product that, can be put over the cover row. Usually there's some type of hoop, whether it be a wire, metal wire, a piece of plastic PVC pipe, something to hold that up, because you need that airspace between the cover and the plant to get that insulation. Another positive point on row covers is leaving those on. The plants can grow for a while. They actually provide some protection from insect pests, so you can keep insects off of those plants for a portion of the growing season. So you might not have to use pesticides until later in the growing season. But also remember, if insects can't get there, if they are plants that require insects to pollinate them, to produce the vegetable, to produce the fruit on that plant, you need to open up those and remove those row covers to allow the pollinators, the bees, the wasps, the flies in there to do the pollination for you. There's all type of, the old English version of cloches that are just basically, they originally were glass bells that you put over plants to keep them from, give them frost protection in the early part of the season. You can make your own out of juice containers, milk jugs, whatever you might have. Again, if it's a completely enclosed environment on a sunny day, you will need to go out and remove those or tilt them up so they can cool off underneath it. Some of them, the opening allows that to happen. But another thing to think about is we don't want that plant leaf up against that plastic or glass, because if it is a cool evening and there is frost, that cold temperature just transfers through that material into that leaf. So again, you need that airspace inside of that container to provide that insulation on them. But again, the cool season crops, the lettuces, the kales, collard greens that are pictured here, these are the things that can actually be here in the next week or so, be put out in the garden. We want to get that garden prepared and tilled before we reach that, get them out there. Anything you can do before that time will just help that plant grow much more better and quicker once it gets in the soil. But again, cool season crops, anytime here, the end of March, 1st of April, some of those can be put out into the soil, into the actual garden. Warm season crops, it's just best to hold off on them. Keeping them, not putting them out until that Mother's Day, second week of May timeframe. That's when we pass that frost-free date for most of southern Indiana. You just run the risk of having more issues. You put the tomatoes out too early, the soil is still cold, the air is cold, they sit there, they struggle. You're just going to have more problems with disease issues than if you put out a healthy plant into an environment that takes off and grows quickly. So again, just hold off. We get too anxious, get ready to get out there. I was at a big box store and a greenhouse yesterday, and they have all types of plants out there. They have tomatoes out there, and I'm going, you should not be putting this tomato out there. And if you bring it home and have to keep it inside, again, it's not getting enough sunshine, things of that nature. So just hold off and wait. You'll be better off, and I always tell people, if you take a nice healthy tomato plant transplant that's about 5 or 6 inches tall, planted out in the right conditions around Mother's Day, it will probably have ripe tomatoes on it just the same time as that big 2-gallon one that you paid $10 for, it's already blooming, and set it out. So put a plant in its correct conditions, it can take off and and grow and produce when it needs to be producing. Before I move on, Jill, there's another publication that you might find the link for, and that's the HO32, the Home Gardener's Guide from Purdue. And you might drop that in the chat box. It's an excellent publication that tells you all aspects of home gardening for vegetables. You know, it talks about planting and planting and harvesting, and it goes through each species on what needs to be done. But HO32 Home Gardener's Guide from Purdue is an excellent resource if you haven't seen or had a copy of that yet. Was there any other questions, Jill?
Nope, no other questions in the chat.
Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Something else that you can be doing in the garden activities around your house right now is if you have house plants, spring is a good time to come in and repot those. You know, a couple of guidelines is we only want to go up one size larger, so an inch, 2-inch max is the biggest we want to go, increase that diameter of that pot that we're putting them in. And we want to do this in the spring because when you repot a plant, you want to encourage, it will encourage new growth. So we don't want to do that in the fall with house plants because then they're going to sit in the house all winter and not get enough sunlight to grow properly. So growing up, transplanting them now. While you're transplanting them, use a good quality potting soil. You might add a little bit of slow release fertilizer in that potting soil. Something like Osmocote is a brand name, Magamp. You know, there's all different brands out there, but something that will just release a little bit of fertilizer in to that house plant. But transplanting them, putting them in a nice sunny location. When it warms, you can actually move them outside in a deck area, porch area, under a tree somewhere, you know. But transplanting those house plants now is an excellent idea. Again, want to make sure they have drainage so they're not setting in water. Those roots need air just like the leaves do, so we don't want a waterlogged soil. We want a light, airy potting soil, little fertilizer, and they'll take off and grow quite well. You know, if you are moving them outside, make sure we move past that frost-free date, that Mother's Day time, because you need to stop and think almost all of our houseplants are tropical plants. So they don't enjoy cool weather at all. They like hot, steamy. Most of these are from the jungles of South America or Africa, places of that nature that they grow naturally. So they don't like cold weather at all. So don't get in too big a hurry as you move those plants out. Okay, I've kind of run out of my material. So on the screen there is Jill and I's contact information. What I would like to do is just open it up to general garden questions because I want to make sure you get the information that you are wanting out of these programs. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up. You can unmute your mics if you have questions, and we're here to try to answer them. So what are the things you're doing in gardening now that you have a question about? Don't be shy. This is your chance. Anybody? I can't believe no one has a question. You can type it in the chat if you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I started doing a compost pile last year, and I don't know if I'm doing it right. And I got kicked out of the Zoom, so I don't know if that was covered while I was trying to log back in. But I don't know, how do I know when it's done? And
Okay.
and
Yeah, there's different levels to do compost. There is actually, Kyle, is next month's program on composting?
Yes, it is, Richard. April 14th is on Compost.
Okay. So if you want the full in-depth, next month on April 14th, they'll go into really depth of composting. But basically, my theory on compost is you can't really do it wrong. If you think you're doing it wrong, it's just going to take longer. So, a couple of things that you need to do is, need to keep a combination of fresh stuff and dry stuff, browns and greens in there. But actually, if you just keep turning it, it's sooner or later going to break down. And finished compost, you should be able to take a handful of it, and you can't, by looking at it, you cannot determine what it came from. It should just be brown, undetermined, organic matter is when it's done. And if there's a few sticks in it, larger pieces, it's not going to matter. You can add that to the garden and it'll be fine. But the more you turn it, the more you stir it, the quicker it's going to break down. And
Okay, thank you. And that kind of brings me to another question.
Yes.
I've been seeing a lot on YouTube and TV about, I think it's called hugel culture, where they fill raised beds, which is what I'm going to have this spring, is raised beds, but they fill it with like larger sticks and I guess larger organic matter. And I didn't know if anybody had an opinion on whether that's a good thing to do, or if I should stay away from it and just go with the garden soil or the topsoil like we were kind of planning on.
I am not familiar with that concept at all. John, Kyle, Jill, have you heard anything about that? It sounds interesting, and I kind of understand some of the concepts they're trying to do. That stuff is going to break down over time, and it's also probably helping with aeration of that garden soil, things of that nature. But I am just not familiar with. And what did you say it was called? What type of culture was it?
I think it's a German word. It's called hugel culture. It's like HUEGEL and culture with a K. It's all one word.
Okay. I don't know.
I saw it on a YouTube. It was an Australian gardener, and he had almost waist high raised beds, and that's how he was filling the bottom portion, so he didn't have to fill them all with the topsoil.
Becky, this is John. In Dearborn County, our Master Gardener President, Carolyn Stewart, has kind of dipped her toe in the water of hugel culture. She gave a presentation to our active group about 2 years ago. I threw a publication in the chat that may be able to answer a few of your questions, but Becky, if you're in Dearborn County, we'd be happy to get you in touch with Carolyn. She's always trying something new and innovative when it comes to gardening.
Okay, I'll check it out. I'm in Floyd, but thank you for that link.
Richard, we have some other questions that have come into the chat.
Okay.
If you can't rotate, what steps do you need to do early to prevent disease?
Okay. If you can't rotate, just some basic things that you would normally do, have to think about that disease, triangle. You have to have a host plant, let's just say tomatoes. You have to have the disease organism, which is typically a fungus or bacteria. And if you've had that plant there for a couple of years, sometimes they overwinter and plant debris on the soil. So maybe, before you do the tillage or in the fall of the year, remove all that plant disease and, dispose of it. So it's not there to reinfect. So you're not, causing more of an issue by having excess, disease organisms there. The other portion of that disease triangle is usually moisture. So let's think about what we can do to reduce that moisture on those plants. Spread those tomato plants out a little bit so there's air movement through them, so they dry off quicker, so there's not as much opportunity for that fungus or bacteria to get into the plant. So sanitation, air movement are two great things that you can do to help prevent those diseases early in the season.
All right, great. Another question, and I know you kind of touched on this and we have a compost session next time, but what about using twigs, sticks, and limbs in compost?
Yeah, all that stuff can go in there, but just keep in mind, the bigger the piece you're starting with, the longer it's going to take for that compost to break down. So, if you can, break those twigs up, if you have some type of wood chipper and run those branches through a wood chipper first, again, anything that you can do to get those into smaller parts to start with, you're going to get that compost quicker.
Fantastic. Another one, can you safely use lawn insecticides in your garden?
Okay. With insecticides and all pesticides, whether it's insecticides, herbicides, whatever, you should only be using on crops that are on that container that are labeled for that product. So if you are using a grass fungicide that's only labeled for turf grass, you should probably not be using that product on a tomato or something in your vegetable garden. Again, only use products that are labeled for that crop on that label. Yes, they might be the same active ingredient, but we don't know anything about the rest of that product, that what we call the carrier of that product. So it might not be toxic to grass, but it might be toxic to tomatoes, or it might be toxic to us if we eat that tomato. So again, only use products that are labeled for that crop. Does that answer their question, you think?
I think so. How soon should Roundup-like products become effective with a temperature concern?
Okay. With the Roundup, the glyphosate products, they are only effective on actively growing plant parts. So if that plant is not actively growing, if it hasn't reached a temperature to break out of dormancy, and growing, it's not going to be effective. So if it's a winter annual, like chickweed or henbit, and it's growing like gangbusters out there, Roundup type products, glyphosate products would be effective on them. But if it's something like, some perennial weed that hasn't broken dormancy and it's still brown out there, it's not going to be effective using Roundup to control that until it starts growing again. So again, using those products, and I just warn, my standard warning with those type products is they are a non-selective herbicide, those glyphosate products. So if you're using it around the vegetable garden, making sure that it doesn't get sprayed on the crops, on the tomatoes, on the beans, that it doesn't drift over, blow over as you're applying it, because it will damage, will kill if it gets enough on any of the crops you're growing. So doing something to direct spray, using a paintbrush and paint on the weed that you want to control. Anything that you can do to keep it off of those crops.